The silence was almost absolute as Daniel drove along the dirt road that wound through the dense forest. Only the occasional sound of branches snapping under the tires and the distant chirping of birds broke the monotony of the journey. He adjusted the rear-view mirror, watching the horizon line fade behind him. Ahead, the tall trees closed in like walls, plunging the environment into an unsettling twilight. The village, according to the worn map he carried, was less than 10 kilometers away. Daniel was a writer. After 2 moderately successful books, he felt he needed something bigger, something more visceral. That's why he had left the comfort of city life and embarked on this journey in search of inspiration. He had heard of Sal Martinho, a village forgotten by time, where stories of hauntings and mysterious creatures had circulated for decades. It was exactly the kind of setting he needed to write something truly unforgettable. When he finally saw the first wooden rooftops emerging between the trees, a shiver ran down his spine. The village seemed suspended in time, with its old rustic houses and dirt streets. There were no signs of electric poles or modern cars. A few people walked slowly through the streets, but they all seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. Daniel couldn't help but notice the stairs following him as he parked his car near the small central square. He stepped out, stretching his legs after hours of driving. The air was humid and carried a faint smell of burnt wood. Approaching one of the few buildings that looked like a store, he pushed the door open, greeted by the sound of a rusty bell. "Good afternoon," he said, smiling. The shopkeeper, a thin, gray-haired man, looked up with a suspicious expression. "You're not from around here." "No, I'm a writer. I came to research the stories of this place. I'm looking for inspiration." The man frowned, exchanging a quick glance with an elderly woman sitting in the corner. She crossed herself and murmured something inaudible. "Inspiration?" the shopkeeper asked. "You better go back to where you came from. This is no place for the curious." Daniel laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Don't worry, I won't cause any trouble. I just want to hear some local stories. Maybe interview some residents." The man sighed, picking up a sack of flour from a shelf. "If it's stories you want, have you heard of the beast that roams these woods?" "The beast?" Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. The woman in the corner stood abruptly, looking frightened. "That's enough, Jorge. We don't need to attract more trouble. He's going to find out anyway," the man muttered. Daniel waited in silence as the shopkeeper turned his attention back to him. On nights of a full moon, something comes out of the forest. We don't know what it is, but it has taken many of us. Animals, children, even adults. All we find is blood and tracks on the ground. They say it's a werewolf. Daniel raised his eyebrows. He hadn't expected something so direct, but it was perfect. "And has anyone seen this creature?" "Those who saw it didn't live to tell the tale," the shopkeeper replied, with a seriousness that made Daniel's smile falter. Back at the inn where he was staying, Daniel couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He had spent the afternoon exploring the village, hearing fragments of stories and observing the tension that seemed to grow as the sun set. Windows were boarded up, and candles were lit even before nightfall. Sitting on his bed with a notebook on his lap, he began jotting down his first impressions. Collective fear. Werewolf as a symbol of the unknown. Village trapped in time. Atmosphere of isolation. Suddenly, a distant sound interrupted his thoughts. It was a howl. Long, sharp, and so deep it seemed to vibrate in the walls. Daniel froze, the pencil still in his hand. He tried to rationalize. It must be a wolf or some other wild animal. But the silence that followed was even more unsettling. He looked toward the window, where the full moon shone brightly, illuminating the trees in the distance. For a moment, Daniel felt a pang of fear, not the kind he sought for his writing, but something more primal, visceral. He closed the notebook and decided that the next day he would explore the forest. After all, inspiration didn't just come from conversations. He needed to see for himself. The rising sun slowly dissipated the mist hovering over the trees, but not enough to make the forest any less menacing. Daniel adjusted his backpack and quickened his pace, guided by the amateur map a young villager had sketched for him the night before. According to the locals, there was an old cabin about 3 kilometers from the village, abandoned for years. No one dared to go there anymore, but Daniel couldn't resist the magnetic pull of its story. The sounds of the forest were both soothing and unsettling. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional snapping of dry branches created a natural symphony, interrupted only by the crunch of his boots on the damp ground. After about an hour of walking, he saw the cabin. It was a small, fragile-looking structure with rotting boards and broken shingles. One window was partially ajar, and the wooden door was slightly open, as if waiting for his arrival. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity outweighed any fear. He pushed the door open, which creaked ominously before revealing a dusty interior. The smell of mold and rotting wood was strong, but Daniel ignored the discomfort and began to explore. There was an old, broken bed in the corner, a table covered with forgotten objects, and a bookshelf with moldy books. He walked over to the table, where something caught his attention. A thick notebook with a worn leather cover. Daniel opened the notebook carefully, blowing off the dust that covered the pages. What he found inside sent chills down his spine. The diary began on a somber note. "My name is Miguel, and this cabin is my refuge. Here, I hide from myself, from my true nature, and from everyone who might suffer because of me." Daniel sat down, overcome by a mix of fascination and unease. The following pages describe Miguel's life, a man who believed he was cursed. He narrated the transformation he underwent during every full moon. Unbearable pain, bones twisting, and muscles tearing to make way for the beast. "I try to fight it," one passage read, "but it's like fighting hunger. The more I resist, the stronger the thirst becomes. The smell of blood calls to me, and no matter how hard I fight, the beast always wins in the end." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he read the vivid details of the transformations. The account was so graphic that it was impossible not to imagine Miguel's suffering. He spoke of hunts, of victims whose faces he could barely remember, and worse, of the guilt that consumed him after each night of horror. As Daniel flipped through the pages, he realized the diary was also a sort of guide. Miguel had studied his curse and tried to discover ways to control it. He mentioned herbs, rituals, and methods of containment, but at the end of each attempt came the same sentence: "I failed. The beast is stronger." Daniel wondered if all of this was real or just a product of a disturbed man's mind. Still, he couldn't ignore the disturbingly specific details and the resemblance to the stories he'd heard in the village. Turning another page, Daniel found a drawing. It was a grotesque figure, half man, half wolf, with wild eyes and sharp teeth. Below it, a single phrase was written: "If you see this, run." A noise outside the cabin interrupted his thoughts. A dry snap, like the sound of a branch breaking. Daniel looked toward the window, but saw nothing beyond the motionless trees. His heart raced, but he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just a small animal or the wind. He placed the diary in his backpack, determined to examine it more thoroughly later. However, before leaving, something on the floor caught his attention. It was a small wooden box, locked with a rusty padlock. Daniel picked it up, trying to open it without success. It was light, but seemed to contain something important. Outside, the environment felt even more oppressive. The forest was eerily silent, as if something or someone was waiting. Daniel looked around, feeling a growing unease, and began walking back to the village. During the journey, he had the constant sensation of being watched. From time to time, he stopped and looked back, but he never saw anything beyond the trees. Even so, the persistent sounds of rustling leaves and snapping branches seemed to follow his steps, like an invisible shadow. When he finally reached the village's edge, he was sweating despite the cool air. He stopped, glanced back at the forest one more time, and then headed to the inn. Inside his room, he placed the diary on the bed and tried to open the box again, but it remained locked. He sat at the desk and began reading more pages of the diary, eager to unravel the mysteries Miguel had left behind. But as he read, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought something with him, something that shouldn't have been awakened. Night fell over Sal Martinho with a suffocating weight, like a veil of darkness that muffled the sounds and brought forth the most primal fears. Daniel, seated at his room's desk, couldn't take his eyes off Miguel's diary. Each page seemed to draw him in, as if the words had a life of their own. The accounts grew darker as he read on. Miguel described in detail each transformation, every moment of pain and terror as his body twisted. He wrote about how his humanity disappeared, giving way to the monster controlled by an insatiable thirst for blood. "There are nights when I can still remember what I did," one passage read. "But on others, it's all a blur. The faces of my victims haunt me, even when I can't recognize them." Daniel closed the diary for a moment, feeling the weight of the words. He knew he was delving into something far deeper than he'd anticipated, but his curiosity pushed him to continue. He had to understand how far this curse could go. At dawn, Daniel decided to explore the forest further. Something in the diary suggested there was more to the story, perhaps answers to the legends and mysteries surrounding Sal Martinho. He brought the small wooden box, still locked, and a few improvised tools, hoping to open it along the way. The trail was even quieter than the previous day, as if the forest itself were watching. After walking for over an hour, he reached a clearing that seemed to match a description from the diary. An open space surrounded by twisted trees, with deep marks in the soil. Daniel knelt, analyzing the signs. They looked like giant claw marks that had torn through the ground. He pulled the box from his backpack and began prying at the rusty lock with a knife. After several minutes, he managed to break it. Inside the box was a small vial containing a thick, yellowish liquid, along with a piece of paper. He unrolled the paper and read the hastily written words. "To calm the beast. Use with caution." Daniel frowned. Miguel clearly believed he had found a way to contain the curse. But what exactly was this liquid? He stored the vial back in his backpack, determined to investigate further later. That's when he heard the first sound, a loud snap, like a branch breaking under heavy steps. He stood up, looking around, but saw nothing. The sound repeated, closer this time. Daniel's heart began to race. "Is someone there?" he called out, trying to sound confident. No response, only the sound of something moving among the trees. He began to step back slowly but stumbled and fell. When he looked ahead, he saw a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. The creature lunged with terrifying speed. Daniel barely had time to get up before feeling an excruciating pain in his right arm. He screamed, trying to defend himself as sharp claws tore into his skin. Desperate, he grabbed the knife he had used to open the box and slashed at the creature. The beast recoiled, letting out a guttural growl, and vanished into the forest as quickly as it had appeared. Daniel remained there, panting, clutching his bleeding arm. The pain was unbearable, but what terrified him the most was what he had just seen. The creature looked exactly like the drawing in the diary. Half man, half wolf, with twisted muscles and savage eyes. He struggled to his feet, holding his injured arm, and began to walk back toward the village. Each step felt heavier, as though the forest were trying to keep him there. Back at the inn, Daniel locked himself in his room and began to treat the wound as best he could. He used water and a cloth to clean the blood, but the cut was deep and jagged. As he tried to stop the bleeding, he noticed something strange. The edges of the wound were beginning to darken, as if something were contaminating his skin. He took the vial from the box and examined the yellowish liquid. Could it be an antidote? Something to delay whatever was happening? Without thinking too much, he applied a few drops of the liquid to the wound. The pain intensified immediately, as though his skin were on fire, but he endured it, hoping it would work. As the night progressed, Daniel began to experience other symptoms. First, a high fever left him weak and sweating. Then, an intense pain in his bones, as if something inside him were trying to move. He tried convincing himself it was just the effects of an infection, but Miguel's words from the diary echoed in his mind. It all begins with the bite. As the full moon rose in the sky, Daniel looked out the window and realized something else was changing. His senses were heightened. He could hear the faintest noises outside the room and smell the night air like never before. He collapsed to the floor, screaming in pain as his body seemed to twist from within. It was as though something was trying to take control, something he couldn't stop. The internal struggle had begun. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, cold light over the village of São Martinho. Daniel woke in the middle of the night with his heart racing, cold sweat dripping down his forehead, and the strange sensation that his body was no longer his own. The pain in his bones continued, pulsing in waves that made his muscles contract involuntarily. He tried to get out of bed, but his legs trembled. As he supported himself on the table, he noticed something alarming. His nails were longer and sharper, and his skin, usually pale, seemed darker, almost grayish. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the smell in the room was overwhelming. Every object exhaled an odor he had never noticed before. The wood of the table, the fabric of the bed, even the faint smell of dust hanging in the air was intensely strong. And then came another smell, a smell of meat, warm and pulsing, coming from outside. Daniel walked to the window and looked down at the sleeping village. The house lights were off, but he could hear every sound, from the whisper of the wind to the slow, deep breathing of those who slept. It was as though his mind was tuned into a frequency he couldn't control. The impulse came without warning. An insatiable hunger took over his body, and before he could rationalize, Daniel was running down the dirt road toward the village center. His vision seemed different, sharper in the darkness, but also distorted, as if he were seeing the world through a wild lens. He stopped in front of a small house, where the scent of fresh meat was strongest. His instincts guided him, and he realized, horrified, that he couldn't resist. Something inside him wanted to break free, to dominate, and he didn't know how to stop it. With a movement that didn't seem his own, Daniel forced open the door of the house. The sound of wood breaking echoed through the room, but no one woke up. He moved silently, stalking like a predator. In the bedroom, a family slept, a man, a woman, and a small child between them. Daniel tried to pull back, tried to stop what he knew was about to happen, but it was as if his body wasn't responding to his mind. His hands, now transformed into claws, advanced before he could fight against himself. The screams echoed through the night, loud and desperate, waking other villagers. When Daniel regained some control, he was covered in blood. His senses were still heightened, and he could taste a metallic flavor in his mouth. Even though he didn't remember biting anyone, he looked around, horrified. The bodies of the family lay on the floor, grotesquely mutilated. Daniel recoiled, trembling, as tears streamed down his face. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. Before he could process what he had done, he heard voices from outside. Neighbors were starting to gather, drawn by the screams. Daniel knew he couldn't stay. He ran out the back door and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, his heart pounding in his mind in a whirl of panic and guilt. He didn't stop until he reached a clearing where he had found Miguel's box. His body trembled with exhaustion, but the hunger still burned within him. Even after the massacre, it seemed the beast inside him was not satisfied. Daniel fell to his knees, burying his bloody hands in the earth. Miguel's diary had been right. The curse wasn't just physical, but a force that consumed the soul. He remembered a specific passage. The first massacres are always the hardest to forget. It's when you realize that the beast not only kills, but also corrupts who you are. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Someone was approaching. He looked around, tense, but couldn't tell where it was coming from. The feeling of being followed had lingered since the village, and now it felt more real than ever. Daniel stood up, his instincts still sharp. He didn't know whether to run or fight, but one thing was certain. He wasn't alone in that forest. Dawn passed slowly, with Daniel hidden among the trees, trying to understand what was happening to him. The first light of day began to rise, and he realized something. Control over his body was returning. He looked at his hands, which were slowly returning to their human form, though still stained with blood. The pain in his bones faded, but in its place came the memory of what he had done. In the distance, the sound of voices and hunting dogs approached. The villagers would not let the massacre go unpunished, and Daniel knew he had to flee. But where? The curse had turned him into a monster, and he had no idea how to fight it. But one thing was certain. The beast inside him wasn't dormant, just waiting for its next opportunity. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the weight of what Daniel had done. The village of Sal Martinho lay in complete silence, but Daniel could no longer ignore the sound of his own breathing. The taste of blood was still in his mouth, the scent of fresh meat filling his nostrils. He was lost, not only physically but spiritually. With each passing moment, the beast inside him grew stronger, harder to control. He walked through the forest, each step echoing in a wild way, as if his body were out of sync with his mind. The pain in his joints was intense, but it wasn't the physical pain that tormented him. The real torment came from the battle being fought inside him, the struggle for his own humanity. The beast challenged him constantly, whispering in his mind, telling him that he had no control, that the beast was winning. "You are the beast, Daniel. You always were," murmured a deep, threatening voice inside his head. "You can't escape who you really are." But Daniel knew there was still a chance. He knew that if he followed the right path, he could win. He had read everything Miguel had written about the inner struggle, about the moments when he thought he would lose his humanity forever. Daniel didn't want to follow the same fate. He didn't want to lose himself completely. He moved away from the clearing, searching for some sort of answer, some sign that the solution was closer. In the back of his mind, he remembered a final part of Miguel's diary. The only way to fight the beast is to face it head-on, not by running, not by hiding. You must accept it in order to control it. These words resonated inside him as he advanced through the narrow trails of the forest, feeling the full moon guiding him. The transformation was beginning again, and he could feel his body twisting, his muscles stretching as if they were going to tear his skin. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He had to fight. He had to face the truth of what he was becoming. The sound of distant footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Daniel froze. He knew what this meant. The hunter was lurking. No longer the dogs, but a human hunter. Someone who had likely learned about the massacre and was now pursuing him with a clear purpose: to kill the beast. With a quick movement, Daniel hid in the shadows of the trees, watching the hunter approach. The man was armed with a knife and a torch, his expression tense and focused. Daniel knew he didn't have a chance to fight him in his human form. Not now, but he had to try. He couldn't let more people die because of him. The inner battle inside him intensified. He felt his mind being crushed by the beast, but he wouldn't give in. He didn't want to be a monster. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the man in front of him and took the first step. The ground was wet, and his feet made as little noise as possible. The hunter still hadn't noticed him. The sound of the torch being raised cut through the night's silence. The hunter was approaching the clearing, oblivious to any signs of movement. That's when Daniel lunged at him, his instincts taking over once again. The beast consumed him, but he fought against it. He wasn't just a beast. He was still Daniel. The impact was brutal. The hunter, caught by surprise, tried to react, but Daniel was already on top of him, his wild claws and teeth finding their mark. The man screamed, but his struggle was brief. When Daniel finally stopped, the hunter lay on the ground, bloodied and lifeless. What remained of Daniel was a shadow of the man he once was, struggling against the identity that was slowly slipping away. He stepped back from the body, breathing heavily and gasping for air. The beast inside him was satisfied, but Daniel knew it wouldn't end there. He had won a battle, But the war was far from over. He didn't know how long he would be able to maintain control, but he knew that with each passing night, the struggle would become more intense, and he would be closer to losing himself completely. With his eyes fixed on the horizon, Daniel made a silent promise. He wouldn't give up. He would face the beast inside him until the end, even if it meant facing his own demise. The fear of losing himself to his own nature was great, but the fear of killing more people was even greater. He walked through the forest, feeling more alone than ever, but determined to find a way to end the curse. Whatever it took, he would do it, even if it meant losing himself completely in the battle against the beast. The tranquility of the morning was shattered when the screams began to echo through Sal Martinho. The small village, which had been immersed in its usual calm, soon found itself engulfed by an indescribable terror. The massacre from the night before was no longer a mystery. It was a cruel and horrifying reality. The streets were empty, but fear hung heavily in the air, even thicker than the morning fog. Daniel knew that sooner or later, the villagers would find him. It was impossible to hide a crime like that for long. When the sun finally rose over the horizon, its warm light seemed to evaporate any trace of peace. He watched from a distance, hidden among the trees at the edge of the village, feeling the weight of guilt pressed down on his shoulders. Every scream that spread through the village was a reminder of what he had become. But the fear wasn't only his. The people of Sal Martinho were terrified. The news of the massacre spread quickly, and the villagers gathered in the main square, whispering about what should be done. Some spoke of the possibility of a wild beast from the forest. Others, more superstitious, believed the presence of evil was being announced, just like the old legends about werewolves. And amidst the crowd, fear spread like wildfire. Daniel knew that if he stayed there, he would soon be found. But he didn't want to run. He needed to face what he was, the monstrosity that had formed inside him. He didn't want to be a fugitive anymore. Meanwhile, the village leader, a man named Joao, was organizing a group of hunters. They were armed with lanterns, knives, and even improvised firearms, all with a single purpose in mind: to hunt down the beast terrorizing their village. Daniel watched from a distance, knowing that if he was found, the fight would be inevitable. This wasn't the kind of village that would forgive such atrocities. Although the villagers were known for their hospitality and kindness, rumors of the old werewolf legend still hung in the air. They didn't know that the beast was right in front of them, disguised as a man tormented by the curse that dominated him. Tension grew with each passing minute. The hunters spread out through the forest, surrounding the area where Daniel was hiding. The screams of terror in the streets were now joined by the hurried sounds of footsteps, and the hunt for the creature took on a desperate tone. Daniel knew he didn't have much time left. He needed to leave before the hunters found him. But the beast inside him knew this too, and it was growing stronger. As Daniel tried to move away, the transformation began again. He felt his bones cracking and his flesh stretching, his body becoming something completely different. The pain flooded over him in an overwhelming wave, and in a matter of seconds, he was back in his werewolf form, wilder and more untamable than ever. Hunger overtook him once again. The scent of human flesh, mixed with the fear in the air, made him lose all control. He was no longer just Daniel. He was a beast, and nothing else mattered but the hunt. With a low growl, Daniel advanced, running with the speed and agility of a predator. The hunters were close, and soon he encountered them one by one in the middle of the forest. The first scream that tore through the night was from a man who, in his eagerness to capture the beast, didn't notice the threat until it was too late. The beast didn't ask questions. With the ferocity of an animal, it attacked quickly, killing the hunter before he could even react. The other hunters heard the scream and rushed to help, but they weren't prepared for what they would find. The beast that Daniel had become wasn't just a monster, it was an unstoppable force. One by one, the hunters fell, trying to fight, trying to survive, but unable to combat something that seemed indestructible. When the last hunter finally fell, Daniel stood in silence. The transformation slowly began to dissipate, but the damage had already been done. He was alone in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the bodies of the hunters, his own thoughts echoing in his mind. The beast inside him was still there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to take control again. He knew the struggle was far from over. The souls of those he had killed would not let him rest. And the villagers, now more determined than ever, would not rest until the beast was destroyed for good. Daniel didn't know how far the curse would take him, but one thing was certain. He couldn't escape his fate. The night was darker than usual, with clouds covering the moon, making São Martinho even more isolated from the light. Tension hung in the air, like a forewarning of something inevitable. Daniel, now aware that the nightmare he was living was only getting worse, hid in the forest, far from the village. But he couldn't escape the weight he carried. The faces of the victims, the screams echoing in his mind, all of it tormented him relentlessly. Among the villagers, one figure was the most affected by these horrors. Ana. She was João's younger sister, the village leader, and one of the most beloved people among the villagers. Ana was different from the others. She had a pure heart and a kindness that stood out in the village. But her fate was about to be sealed in a tragic way, and she didn't know it. Ana had always been friends with Daniel. Since childhood, there was a special bond between them, one that was never broken, not even over the years. When she heard the rumors about the massacre, her heart shattered. She couldn't believe that Daniel was capable of such atrocities because she knew him better than anyone in the village. She believed he was fighting against something much greater than himself. However, the people didn't share her view, and the feelings of hatred toward Daniel were growing by the day. That night, Ana decided she would face her brother and the other hunters. She wanted to find Daniel and convince him to return to the village, apologize for his actions, and, if necessary, try to help him rid himself of the curse. But Anna's decision would prove fatal. Even with a heart full of good intentions, she didn't know what awaited her in the darkness of the forest. She ventured alone, unaware that the hunters had organized once again, this time with the intention of capturing or killing the creature. They were searching for Daniel, but Anna's presence went unnoticed. When she arrived at the clearing where Daniel, in his werewolf form, was hiding, the silence was absolute. The wind whispered through the trees, but no human sound could be heard. Ana called out for Daniel, her voice soft and full of concern. "Daniel, is that you?" She didn't know it, but as she spoke his name, something inside Daniel stirred. The monster within him, which had remained quiet for a while, smelled the blood and heard the call of his childhood friend. He knew who was there, but the beast in his mind was becoming stronger, hungrier. Daniel watched Ana from the shadows, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He loved her, but he knew he couldn't be close to her anymore. He had become something impossible to love. But the pain of seeing Ana there, alone and vulnerable, stopped him from attacking immediately. He hesitated. He wanted to warn her, but his wolf instincts were taking over his reason. Ana, in turn, was desperate. She knew something was wrong, that the Daniel she knew wasn't there anymore. Deep in her heart, she felt that something dark had taken over him. She tried to step closer to the sound she heard, but at that moment, Daniel couldn't control himself any longer. The beast fully unleashed itself. With a savage scream, Daniel leapt from the shadows, charging at Ana with the speed of a predator. She didn't have time to react. The monster knocked her to the ground with a brutal strike. She screamed for help, but the words caught in her throat. The smell of fear paralyzed her, and before she could understand what was happening, the beast was on top of her, its sharp claws and cruel teeth ready to strike. In that moment, the pain Daniel felt wasn't just physical, but emotional. It felt like he was tearing his own heart apart. His only friend, his only reason to try to redeem himself, was now at the mercy of the creature he had become. But the instinct of the monster was stronger than his will. He attacked, and Anna's scream echoed through the forest, breaking the silence of the night. The massacre wasn't long, but it was devastating. When Daniel's transformation began to dissipate, He found himself back in his human form, amidst the traces of destruction. Anna was there, lying on the ground, motionless, her eyes still open, as if waiting for an explanation that would never come. The look she gave him, filled with pain and despair, was a last reflection of a friendship he had destroyed without intending to. Daniel fell to his knees, his mind shattered. He couldn't understand what he had just done. He had killed the only person who still believed in him, the only one who still gave him a chance at redemption. The weight of guilt crushed him. There was no escape now, no salvation. He could no longer live with what he had done. The hunters arrived shortly after, finding Anna's body and, in the distance, Daniel, in a state of devastation. They knew that the beast that had caused so much suffering was now before them, but the sight of Daniel, defeated and broken, made them hesitate. He was no longer an uncontrollable monster. He was a man destroyed, consumed by the pain of his own actions. But the hunters didn't care about that. To them, he was the beast that needed to be killed. And Anna's tragedy, a painful reminder that evil could never be forgiven. The dawn brought with it a deathly stillness, a calmness that seemed more like a harbinger of death than a promise of renewal. San Martinho was in ruins. The villagers were terrified, and the hunters, after Anna's tragedy, were more determined than ever to destroy the creature that had cast the shadow of death over the village. Daniel, after the irreparable loss he caused, knew there was no turning back. The fight for his humanity had ended, and the beast he feared was in full control. He walked through the empty streets, his eyes clouded with guilt and pain. His feet felt heavy with each step, as if the weight of his actions was enough to crush him. He knew death was at his doorstep, but he didn't know if he had the strength to face it. The pain of losing Anna and the suffering of his own hands consumed him in an indescribable way. He had destroyed everything he loved, and now there was only one choice left. In the distance, the hunters' shouts began to echo through the mountains. They were close, and he could no longer flee. He knew it was no longer possible to hide the monster he had become. What remained of his humanity was disappearing, and the wolf inside him was ready to take full control. Reaching the edge of the forest, where the shadow of night always seemed thicker, Daniel stopped. He knew this was his last chance to end his torment. He moved away from the village, heading toward the old stone altar deep in the forest, a place he had visited in his childhood with his parents before everything turned into a nightmare. It was a symbolic place, where many believed that sacrifices could appease the spirits that haunted the woods. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow him as he advanced, but Daniel no longer cared. He knew he was heading toward his own destruction, but perhaps, in doing so, he could redeem himself in some way. His mind was shattered, but the instinct for survival still fought inside him, against everything he knew he had become. Reaching the altar, Daniel fell to his knees. The sound of nature around him seemed to silence as he prepared to face his own pain. He knew the hunters were behind him, and this could be his only chance to end the suffering he had caused. He no longer wanted to be a threat to others, nor carry the weight of guilt any longer. It was at this moment that a figure appeared from the shadows of the forest. João, Anna's brother, was there. His eyes were filled with rage, but also with sorrow. He didn't need to say anything, for the hatred and pain were written on his face. He was there to do what he felt was his responsibility, to end the creature that had taken his sister's life and destroyed the village. But Daniel didn't rise. He knew he no longer deserved life, but he felt there was still one last thing he could do to redeem himself. With trembling hands, he drew a knife from his belt and gripped it tightly. He was ready to face his fate in the final way. He no longer wanted anyone else to fall victim to the monster he had become. João, looking at the man who had once been his brother, hesitated. He knew Daniel was still fighting the curse, that the beast he had become wasn't entirely him. But the losses had been too great for him to simply let him go. He raised his weapon, a silver sword, the only thing that could truly destroy the creature, and moved toward Daniel. The confrontation was brief but violent. Daniel, in his human form, no longer had the strength to fight. He felt the weight of his guilt, and his pain in every blow he received. Joao's final strike was precise. The sword pierced Daniel's heart, but before he fell, an expression of relief crossed his face. He no longer felt the weight of the beast, nor the torment of his curse. He had done what he could. He had sacrificed himself to put an end to the suffering of all. As Daniel's life slipped away, a strange peace took over his body. He was finally free from the curse that had consumed him for so long. Joao stayed by his side, his eyes brimming with tears, not knowing whether he felt relief or a deeper sorrow. He had avenged his sister, but at the same time, he had lost the last piece of his own humanity. The hunters, who had followed Joao to the altar, arrived at that moment. They looked at Daniel's lifeless body, and the sense of justice was accompanied by a dark feeling of loss. What remained of the village, still marked by pain, would now have to move on without him. Daniel's tragedy would not be easily forgotten, but at least he was no longer a threat. Daniel's final sacrifice was the last chapter of his struggle, a struggle that had no winners, but at least brought an end. The village of Salmartinho could now breathe again, but the memories of all that had happened would never fade.